A neon-clad stranger storms a sheriff's mountain cabin, accusing his daughter of trespassing, unaware she's about to face the law she just called. I opened the front door of my mountain cabin to find a stranger standing there in a neon pink tracksuit. Her arms crossed so tightly I could hear the fabric squeak in the cold morning air. Before I could say a word, she jabbed a manicured finger past my shoulder and shouted that my daughter was trespassing and she'd already called the cops. I squinted at her, still holding my steaming coffee mug like a peace offering, trying to process why a woman I'd never seen before was threatening to have my teenage daughter dragged out of her own home. The funny thing was I didn't even need to ask who she was because the type was obvious. Expensive sunglasses at dawn, entitled Tone. The Cadillac SUV parked sideways halfway across my gravel drive. I asked if she wanted to come inside to talk about it like adults, but she barked back that she didn't talk to squatters and demanded I produce the child so she could be removed immediately. I sipped my coffee to hide my grin because my daughter Sarah was standing right behind me recording the whole thing on her phone. And in about 30 seconds, this woman was going to learn the hard way that she hadn't just threatened any random mountain dad, but the county sheriff himself, which made me both the landlord and the law in these woods. She didn't know that yet, though, so she dialed 911 dramatically with her back turned to me, and I almost offered to patch her through myself just to see her face. When dispatch told her exactly who was about to answer her call, I watched Sarah bite her lip to stop from laughing while the woman's voice rose an octave as she barked at the dispatcher that she needed immediate backup to evict a minor from private property. My private property. It was early enough that the sun hadn't burned off the frost from my patrol cruiser parked behind the cabin, which made it even funnier that she hadn't noticed the sheriff's star on the door when she strutted up the drive. I leaned against the porch railing and waited for the punchline because once she realized who owned this land and who she'd just accused of kidnapping his own daughter, she'd either melt into the dirt from embarrassment or double down like the Karens of the world always do. Sarah stepped out beside me, holding her phone high to make sure she caught every wild word this woman spewed. And I couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride in her calm grin. Karen. I decided she was definitely a Karen. She spun around and caught sight of the cruiser just as the dispatcher must have told her who they were sending because her face shifted from righteous to confused to insulted in record time. She hung up mid-sentence and jabbed her finger at me again. This time demanding to see my badge because obviously I couldn't be the real sheriff if I lived in a rustic log cabin with a kid who dared wear pajama pants after sunrise. I pulled my badge from my belt and let it dangle in front of her just long enough for her eyes to widen before she snapped back that it was probably fake and she'd be bringing the real police to handle this impersonation. Sarah's giggle slipped out then, and I didn't stop her because it was about time someone laughed in this mess. Karen pivoted on her spotless sneakers and stomped back to her SUV, yelling into her phone again, probably giving dispatch the world's worst description of an imaginary squatter sheriff with a teenage hostage in plaid pants. I watched her tires spit gravel as she sped away, and I turned to Sarah, who shrugged and asked if I thought she'd come back. I told her people like Karen always come back and they never come alone because it's not enough for them to be wrong. They need the whole neighborhood to see them be wrong together. Sure enough, it wasn't even noon before my radio crackled to life and my deputy called saying someone had just flagged down a pair of town cops at the gas station claiming the county sheriff was holding a minor against her while up at the old Miller cabin. That was my cabin. I told him to sit tight and that I'd handle it myself, which made him laugh under his breath because every deputy in the county knew how these stories ended when entitled tourists picked the wrong mountain to claim. When I pulled down the drive an hour later, I found Karen back at my gate. This time, flanked by 3 HOA board members who looked more confused than convinced and 2 local patrol cars parked with lights flickering like it was a full-blown standoff. Sarah leaned out the cabin window, waving at me with a sandwich in hand, completely unbothered by the circus gathering in our yard. Karen pointed dramatically from me to Sarah, shouting that I'd locked up a minor and was refusing to turn her over to the proper authorities. I parked the cruiser halfway down the path so nobody could say I tried to run them off the road, though the thought crossed my mind for a second when Karen's Cadillac door nearly hit my bumper. The 2 town officers approached me cautiously asking for ID even though I was still wearing the county badge on my hip and the patches on my shirt left no doubt about who I was. I handed them my license and watched them scan it like they expected it to vanish in their hands. Karen cackled when one of them suggested we might want to clear this up inside, but she doubled down, insisting they arrest me on the spot for impersonating an officer and trespassing on her private vacation rental. I asked her to show me her deed, and she whipped out a stack of papers printed off the internet with so many scribbles and highlighter marks it looked more like a middle school project than a legal document. I held up the corner of my property survey in response, and one of the HOA guys peered at it, then stepped away from Karen's side like he just realized the tiger he'd been petting had teeth. I asked everyone nicely to step up to the porch so we could settle this with the county records in hand. And when my wife stepped out the front door with the official maps fresh from the clerk's office, you could practically hear the last ounce of Karen's confidence wheeze out of her. Sarah leaned against the railing, filming the whole thing. And when Karen made one final attempt to grab the folder, my wife sidestepped, and Karen slipped on the icy porch rail, landing hard enough to knock over my spare firewood stack. The deputies, who'd been watching without much interest, suddenly found plenty of cause to put Karen in cuffs when she lunged again, yelling about conspiracies and forged documents. I read her rights while Sarah whispered under her breath that we'd have to roast extra marshmallows tonight to celebrate. As Karen was guided down the steps, screaming about lawsuits and wrongful arrests, I caught my daughter's eye and promised her next weekend up here would be quiet again, at least until the next entitled tourist decided to pick a fight with the wrong sheriff's family. After Karen was escorted off my porch the first time, I figured she'd at least have the sense to lick her wounds somewhere far from my stretch of pine and gravel. But by the time Sarah and I were finishing lunch, I saw the same pink tracksuit pacing by the mailbox again, phone pressed to her ear like she was orchestrating a military siege instead of another round of neighborhood drama. Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter munching chips and asked if we should call backup or just pop popcorn. I told her to hold off on the popcorn because if I knew anything about people like Karen, she'd be back at my door before the oil got hot. Sure enough, before I could finish my coffee, she stomped right up to the porch, flanked by a man and woman who looked like they regretted every step that brought them here. She called them her HOA board, which made me nearly spit my drink because our cabin was miles outside the HOA's actual jurisdiction. But that didn't stop her from acting like she was the queen of every pine needle in these woods. She started by waving a new stack of papers under my nose, declaring she'd done some research and discovered my entire cabin was sitting on land improperly deeded by the county decades ago, and that she had every right to demand I vacate the premises until a full survey could be done. I looked at the man beside her, an older gentleman with a weary expression and a clipboard clutched to his chest like a shield. He introduced himself as Tom, mumbled something about being the HOA president, and apologized before Karen shushed him so loudly Sarah flinched inside the cabin. Karen kept on saying she'd called in real law enforcement this time because apparently my badge didn't count if she didn't like the answer I gave her. As if on cue, a pair of patrol cars pulled up, lights flickering in the daylight like we were starring in some low-budget crime drama. The two young officers stepped out trying to look serious, but I could see them sizing up the situation and realizing exactly what kind of circus they'd been dragged into. Karen turned to them and pointed at me like a prosecutor at closing arguments, shouting that I was impersonating the county sheriff to squat on her family's rightful vacation land and that I'd been holding a child hostage to bolster my fake claim. Sarah chose that exact moment to swing the cabin door wide open and lean against the frame, munching another chip, perfectly safe and perfectly amused, which did not help Karen's case one bit. One of the patrolmen asked for my ID and badge, which I handed over without a fuss because there's no harm in letting them do their job by the book. I could feel Karen vibrating beside me like a wasp trapped in a jar, just waiting for them to slap cuffs on me so she could gloat about her big win. When they radioed in my ID and got the all clear that not only was I the real sheriff, but the owner of this particular slice of mountain, her mouth snapped shut so fast I half expected her teeth to crack. But she wasn't ready to give up the stage yet. She turned to the HOA president Tom and demanded he present the paperwork she convinced him to bring. Poor Tom fumbled with his clipboard, flipping through half-completed forms and a folded map that was so outdated it still listed my cabin's location as an old hunting shack from the 50s. I asked him politely if he'd like to see the updated records from the county office, but Karen practically ripped the clipboard out of his hand, shouting that the only records that mattered were the ones she'd printed from her own real estate app. The second officer tried to intervene, suggesting maybe we should all sit down and compare documents calmly, but Karen was having none of it. She demanded they remove me from my own porch while Tom stood there looking like he wished he'd stayed in bed. Meanwhile, the other board member, a woman named Denise, tried to pull Karen aside and whisper sense into her ear, but Karen swatted her off like an annoying fly and doubled down by dialing her phone again to call in what she claimed were higher authorities. I asked the officers if they'd like some coffee while they waited for Karen's next imaginary cavalry to show up, and one of them actually chuckled before catching himself and clearing his throat. Sarah came out with a fresh mug for me and a second one, which she handed to the younger deputy, who accepted it with a grateful nod. Karen looked like she might actually explode at the sight of a sworn officer accepting hospitality from the man she wanted arrested, but instead she spun on her heel and marched back to her SUV, muttering about legal action and false imprisonment. Tom and Denise hovered awkwardly by the porch steps, clearly regretting every HOA meeting that ever gave Karen a shred of perceived power. I asked them what exactly they thought they'd accomplished today, and Tom admitted under his breath that Karen told them my cabin was abandoned government property and that she'd secured special permission to reclaim it for the HOA. Denise jumped in to add that Karen promised them free weekends up here if they helped her run me off, which almost made me laugh, but I bit it back because the deputies were still within earshot. Karen reappeared then, waving her phone like a torch, announcing that she'd spoken to her lawyer, who confirmed I'd be facing charges for impersonation and endangering a minor. I glanced at Sarah, who raised her phone and whispered that she'd been recording every word just in case Karen decided to spin more stories. The younger deputy stepped forward then and gently suggested we might want to move this discussion down to the station if Karen genuinely believed a crime had been committed. Karen jumped at the chance to show off in front of her new audience. So, she ordered Tom and Denise to follow her as she stomped back to her SUV, yelling that she'd see us all in court. I told the deputies I'd be down there shortly, but first I needed to put away the groceries that were still sitting on the porch from this morning's delivery. Sarah asked if she should ride with me, and I said she could come if she wanted, but I knew she'd rather stay and upload the footage in case Karen tried to twist the narrative. By the time I pulled up to the station 20 minutes later, Karen was already inside, arms flailing dramatically as she spun a tale so wild even my desk sergeant was struggling to keep a straight face. She pointed at me the moment I stepped through the door, accusing me of stalking her family for months and stealing their rightful property under the guise of a fake badge. I calmly removed my hat and sat across from her, letting her finish her speech, because I'd learned long ago, the more rope you give people like Karen, the better they hang themselves with it. When she finally paused for breath, I asked the sergeant to pull up the property records in my employment file, which he did with a few clicks. Watching Karen's eyes dart back and forth between the computer screen and my badge was almost worth the headache she'd caused so far. But something in her stare told me she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. By the time the sergeant printed out the last page of records, Karen had turned the waiting area of my own station into her personal courtroom. Pacing back and forth with that same stack of highlighted nonsense, she kept waving at anyone who looked twice. I watched her corner one of my deputies near the coffee machine, demanding to know if he really worked for me or if I'd hired him as an actor to intimidate her out of her rightful claim. The poor kid just nodded politely and refilled his cup, pretending he hadn't heard a word. I sat back in the chair trying not to smile because the more she talked, the deeper she dug that hole. But a part of me was already tired of the circus and wanted to get it wrapped up before she dragged more innocent people into her mess. I leaned forward and asked the sergeant to get the HOA president Tom on the phone since he'd been standing next to Karen during her mountain meltdown and might shed some light on what she thought she was doing. Karen immediately shrieked that Tom was a liar who betrayed her trust and that I had no right to drag her personal business into this county affair. I reminded her that trespassing on my land and making false reports about my daughter made it everyone's business now, especially mine. She shot me a look that could have cracked stone and hissed that she knew powerful people who'd have my badge by morning if I didn't stand down and hand over the cabin to its rightful owner, meaning her. I almost laughed out loud, but I kept my tone even, asking her again for any real paperwork she might want to submit. She slammed her pile of printouts on my desk, scattering sticky notes and mismatched copies of old hunting maps. The sergeant thumbed through them for maybe 10 seconds before setting them aside and quietly pulling up the county's digital registry. It took all of 2 clicks to show my name on the deed. Taxes paid up for 10 years straight. No encumbrances, no liens, no HOA jurisdiction within 10 miles. Karen stared at the screen like it had betrayed her. She sputtered that these records were obviously fake, doctored by my office to keep her from reclaiming what was hers. She started again about some distant cousin who once owned a hunting shack on the ridge and how she'd inherited rights to the entire slope. When I asked her for any proof of this alleged inheritance, she spun back into her story about her lawyer, who apparently was going to burst through the door any second and slap me with papers so heavy I'd never see the inside of my cabin again. I could see the deputies exchanging glances, trying not to grin. The sergeant cleared his throat and suggested maybe we should bring in Tom and the HOA board officially just to get their statements and see who else Karen might be roping into this fantasy. Karen's eyes darted to the door like she was hoping her lawyer would materialize on cue. But instead, Tom himself shuffled in looking like he'd aged a decade in an hour. He had Denise with him, too, and I guess she hadn't let him hide at home. Karen lit up when she saw him, then immediately started pointing at me, saying this was the imposter sheriff she told him about, the squatter who threatened her daughter and vandalized her property. Tom looked at me, then at the sergeant, then at Karen, and said in the flattest voice I'd heard all day that he had no idea what she was talking about. Denise piped up that they checked the HOA's files on the drive back and there was no record of any claim on my land or any adjacent lots. Karen swung on her like a rattlesnake, demanding to know whose side she was on. Denise stepped back, hands up like she didn't want any part of the wildfire that was about to spread. I asked Tom straight up if Karen had forged any signatures or fed them any lies about special permissions. Tom hesitated, which told me enough, but he finally nodded and admitted Karen had pushed him into signing off on some survey requests weeks ago, but never showed him any real documents. Karen's voice cracked when she turned on him, calling him a traitor, a coward, a spineless fool for not backing her up. The sergeant calmly took Tom's statement and made a note to get Denise's, too. While I leaned back and studied Karen's face, she looked less furious now and more cornered, like she'd expected the bluff to scare me into backing down, but instead it had only invited more eyes on every half-truth she'd spun. Still, I knew better than to think she'd roll over without one more desperate swing. She pointed at Sarah's video on my phone and demanded it be confiscated as evidence of my harassment. I told her it was evidence, all right, but probably not the kind she'd want in open court. She screeched that I had no right to record her without her consent, which made Tom snort under his breath because Sarah had filmed everything from our own porch and I didn't need permission to capture my own front yard. Karen switched tactics so fast it almost gave me whiplash. She started sobbing, big gasping tears that made Tom and Denise shift uncomfortably, saying I had threatened her and her family and she'd been so scared for her safety she didn't know what else to do but call the police. I sat there unmoved, letting her wear herself out because the deputies knew the truth, the sergeant knew the truth, and the evidence on Sarah's phone would bury every lie if she tried to twist it further. When her tears didn't soften the room, she straightened up, wiped her cheeks, and hissed that I'd regret humiliating her, that people like me never got away with stepping on people like her, that the county was corrupt and rotten and needed cleaning out. I almost thanked her for the campaign speech, but I bit my tongue because this wasn't over yet. The sergeant asked me if I wanted to press charges right then and there for trespassing, false reporting, and attempted fraud. I said, not yet, because I wanted every loose end tied up first. Karen looked stunned that I wasn't jumping at the chance to slap cuffs on her, but the truth was I wanted her to see just how deep her pit had gotten. I asked the sergeant to run a check on that so-called lawyer she kept throwing around, and he disappeared into the back with my paperwork. Karen folded her arms and glared at me like she was trying to set my hair on fire with her mind. Tom and Denise sat on a bench whispering so quietly I couldn't catch a word, but their faces told me they were done being dragged around like props. Sarah texted me from the cabin saying she'd uploaded the footage to our cloud drive and was making popcorn after all because she figured I'd be hungry when I got back. I told her to save me some and that it wouldn't be much longer. I leaned back, folded my hands over my chest, and waited for Karen's imaginary lawyer to appear or for the next lie to crumble, whichever came first. Because the more I let her speak, the clearer it got that she'd never expected me to stand my ground, much less drag the truth into daylight, or she'd have nowhere left to hide. When the door opened again, it wasn't some slick big city lawyer striding in to rescue Karen from her own tangled mess, but Deputy Ramirez carrying a folder so thin it was practically an insult to every real attorney in the state. Ramirez handed it to the sergeant, who flipped through the couple of flimsy printouts inside and raised an eyebrow at me like he didn't know whether to laugh or sigh. Karen straightened up in her chair, trying to peek over the sergeant's shoulder, but he angled the folder away, then set it down on the desk between us. According to the deputy's quick search, Karen's so-called lawyer was actually an online legal consultant who'd never passed the state bar and whose specialty seemed to be selling boilerplate letters to cranky neighbors for a monthly subscription fee. I let out a low whistle while Karen's mouth flapped silently like a beached fish because I could see the exact moment the reality of her situation finally hit the inside of her skull. Tom shifted beside her, trying to edge farther down the bench like distance alone might spare him the embarrassment of having ever stood next to her in this fight. Denise crossed her arms tight over her chest and stared at the floor. I asked Karen if she wanted to see the county maps again, just in case there was still any confusion about where her imaginary lot might be hiding, but she shot me a look so sharp I could almost feel the sting. The sergeant cleared his throat and asked her directly if she had any legitimate paperwork showing ownership of even a square foot of my property. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, so she slammed her lips shut again and glared at the wall like it owed her an apology. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and told her I'd give her one last chance to come clean about how she got Tom and Denise involved, whether she forged anything or promised them perks for backing her up. Tom coughed and adjusted his glasses, then said in a small voice that Karen told them she'd bought out an old claim from a distant relative who'd once hunted on my ridge back when the county lines were still drawn with a pencil and guesswork. He admitted she never showed him any transfer deed, just a scribbled note she claimed was a receipt from a family trust. Denise confirmed they believed her because she talked so big about cleaning up the neighborhood and reclaiming what was rightfully part of the HOA. Karen's eyes snapped to Tom so fast he flinched like he thought she'd actually hit him right there in the station. She spat out that he was lying to save himself and that they were all in on it with me, conspiring to steal her inheritance. I sat back and let her spin because by now every word just made it clearer to everyone listening that the only thing Karen had inherited was a talent for bluffing with no cards in her hand. The sergeant signaled Ramirez to bring in the actual county maps and a fresh set of signed documents. When Ramirez laid them out on the table, Karen shrank back in her chair, but her eyes darted to every line and dotted border like she was hoping to spot some magical loophole that would conjure her name out of thin air. She didn't find one because there wasn't one. The only signature on the original deed was mine, dated and notarized and matched to my county payroll record and voter registration. Sarah's name wasn't on it, but my daughter had every legal right to be there with me, so any claim about kidnapping was dead on arrival. Karen started to mutter something about harassment again, but her voice was thin now, and nobody leaned in to hear it. Tom took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, looking every bit like a man who'd realized the worst mistake of his term as HOA president was trusting the wrong neighbor's word over a documented title. Denise broke the silence, saying she wanted it on the record that she'd never seen a real deed from Karen, and that if anything, she'd been lied to the same as Tom. The sergeant nodded and had them both write up short statements before they could second-guess themselves. I could see Karen's jaw working like she was chewing gravel, but she didn't interrupt. She knew by now that her voice wasn't going to drown out a signed piece of paper and a whole folder of official seals. When the statements were signed, the sergeant slid them over to me and asked if I wanted to file the charges now or wait. I looked at Karen sitting there, small and quiet for the first time since she'd knocked on my door barking demands, and I felt a flicker of something like pity, but it didn't last long. I told him to start the paperwork, but hold her in the interview room for a bit longer because I wanted to swing back to the cabin and pick up a few more files from my home office just to make sure every loose end was tied down. Karen exploded when she realized I wasn't just bluffing about the charges. She jumped up, knocking her chair back into the wall, shouting that she'd sue the county for harassment, defamation, property theft, civil rights violations, you name it. The deputies just stepped in closer, like they'd seen this tantrum before, which they probably had more than once during her meltdown in my yard. I stepped outside for a breath of cold mountain air before heading back to the cabin. The drive up the ridge felt like a deep exhale after hours of recycled threats and empty bravado. Sarah met me on the porch with that same phone in hand and a grin that told me she'd edited her footage into something airtight. She said she'd titled the video Karen vs. Sheriff, Episode 1, which made me laugh even if I knew it wouldn't see daylight until the paperwork was filed. I grabbed the old survey files and some property tax receipts just to be thorough, then paused by the kitchen window, watching the tree lean sway under a stiff wind that promised snow soon. For years, this cabin had been my shield from exactly this kind of nonsense. But standing there, I realized that shield was only as strong as the line you drew around it, and how hard you were willing to hold that line when someone decided they deserved a piece of it more than you did. Sarah asked if I thought Karen would get jail time, and I told her, probably not, but a record would follow her longer than any idle threat ever could. She nodded, satisfied, then asked if we could pick up pizza on the way back to the station because she was tired of popcorn and wanted real food. I laughed, told her to lock up and double-check the back door. And we drove down together, the mountain behind us and a case file ahead of us that no lawyer, real or fake, was going to erase no matter how many pink tracksuits they strutted in with. When we got back, Karen was sitting in the same chair, arms crossed, head down, muttering to herself, like maybe if she repeated her story enough times, it might turn true. The sergeant gave me a nod when he saw the extra files. And Tom and Denise were still there, too, waiting to make sure their part was clean before they washed their hands of her for good. I set the folder down and watched Karen's eyes flick to it and then away again because she knew it didn't hold anything good for her. In a way, I almost admired the depth of her stubbornness. But mostly, I felt the steady satisfaction that came from seeing a bully's bluff called for what it really was: empty noise bouncing off a wall that wasn't going to budge, no matter how loud she screamed. The last part of this whole mess felt less like law enforcement and more like sweeping out broken glass after a storm that never should have blown through in the first place. Karen sat slumped in that same squeaky plastic chair, her arms folded so tight across her chest, I half wondered if she thought she could squeeze herself out of reality if she just held her breath long enough. Tom and Denise hovered near the hallway like they were afraid she might lunge at them if they turned their backs for too long, but she didn't have much fire left in her. The sergeant flipped through the final stack of statements, the notarized maps, the dated tax records, and that sad excuse for a lawyer's printouts, which looked more ridiculous every time I saw them. I'd brought my receipts and the old cabin survey in person and laid them out on the table one last time like a polite hammer Karen couldn't dodge. She didn't even look this time. She just stared at the blank wall behind me, her lips moving like she was whispering arguments to ghosts who wouldn't answer back. I told the sergeant to finalize the charges: trespassing, false reporting, attempted fraud, obstruction, and a harassment count for good measure. It wasn't the harshest list, but it was enough to stick to her name if she ever tried pulling a stunt like this in someone else's backyard. I knew she'd probably get a decent lawyer this time around, someone who'd plea it all down to community service or probation, but it didn't really matter because the point wasn't jail time. The point was making sure she understood the line she crossed wasn't one she could just redraw with threats and cheap paper. Tom signed his last statement, then practically bolted for the exit when the sergeant told him he was free to go. Denise stayed behind for a second to shake my hand, which caught me off guard. She said she was sorry for the trouble they'd helped stir up by believing Karen's stories and that next time she'd trust county records over rumor. I told her not to worry too much. People like Karen made careers out of looking honest until someone asked for proof. Sarah texted me from the truck. She was getting antsy, wanted to know if we could stop at that gas station diner for burgers because she was starving and sick of waiting around for grown-ups to finish being dramatic. I stepped back into the interview room one last time to see Karen hunched over the table, scribbling something on a legal pad like she thought she could conjure a new ending to all this if she just wrote fast enough. I cleared my throat. She didn't look up. So, I told her straight that a court date would be set in the next week and she'd be notified the right way through channels that couldn't be torn up and denied. I said she'd have every chance to bring real representation if she could find any who touched this without laughing her out the door. Still no eye contact, just her pen scratching across the paper in jerky loops like she was signing away invisible deeds to invisible land. The sergeant nudged me, said they'd hold her for processing, then release her on bond, probably by morning, unless she mouthed off enough to the judge to earn a night in the county cell. I almost hoped she would, but I wouldn't bet on it. The deputies handled the last of the paperwork while I headed outside, breathing in the cold mountain dusk that smelled like pine and wood smoke and freedom from headaches that wore neon pink tracksuits. Sarah bounced in the passenger seat like she'd been cooped up for a week instead of half a day. She peppered me with questions between mouthfuls of fries when we finally pulled into that old diner with a sticky counter and the same 3 old-timers parked at the corner booth every night. She wanted to know if we'd see Karen again, if the HOA would try anything stupid, if maybe we should build a bigger gate at the end of the gravel drive. I told her we probably wouldn't see Karen on our land ever again because the mountain had a way of remembering who belonged and who didn't, and people like her never lasted long when the pine trees closed in and the neighbors stopped answering calls. Sarah grinned and dunked her fries in her shake like it was the most normal thing in the world to talk about crazy property disputes over cheap burgers and melting ice cream. She asked if I was mad at her for recording everything, and I laughed and told her she'd done half my job for me that day. She beamed like I'd handed her an honorary deputy badge right there next to the napkin dispenser. We drove back up the ridge under a sky that was just starting to spit snow flurries, the kind that didn't stick yet, but promised a real blanket by morning. I parked the truck by the cabin porch and killed the headlights, letting the dark swallow us up while the engine clicked and cooled. Sarah grabbed the leftover fries and danced through the front door while I lingered by the truck, looking out at the treeline, listening for anything that felt out of place. But the mountain was quiet again. Just the creak of the pines, the hiss of the wind pushing through the needles like a whisper telling me the line I drew around this place still held strong. Inside the cabin, Sarah was already queuing up her video snippets, bragging she clipped together every second of Karen's meltdown into a tidy timeline that would make any jury or curious neighbor see exactly how deep the nonsense had run. I reminded her not to share it yet, that the legal system needed its moment first, but she just laughed and promised it was safe on our cloud and ready if we ever needed it. She asked if I thought Karen would spin another story somewhere else. And I told her probably, but someone else would be ready next time because bullies didn't really change. They just shifted their noise to the next place they thought was too polite to fight back. Sarah nodded like that made perfect sense to her, a kid who had grown up knowing the woods weren't just trees, but walls when you needed them, and friends when you respected them. She curled up on the couch, the glow from her phone soft on her face, while the wind rattled the windows in that way that always sounded like a promise of winter coming home. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee reheated from the pot that had survived the morning's ambush and leaned against the window frame, watching the last lights of town flicker below the ridge. Tomorrow there'd be paperwork, meetings, calls from reporters, maybe even a few neighborly questions about what really happened up here. But tonight, the mountain was ours again, and the cabin was just a cabin, warm, solid, and exactly where it was meant to be. I stepped outside one last time that night just to stand on the porch and listen to the hush that only comes when trouble finally packs up its noise and drives away. I wasn't naive enough to think I'd never see another entitled neighbor or get dragged into another pointless squabble. But for now, the badge on my belt and the boots on my porch said enough for anyone who dared test the line between what they thought they deserved and what I'd fight to protect. I closed the door behind me, turned off the porch light, and let the mountain keep its secret safe under the snow that started falling in earnest like a blanket tucking us in for the night.